Hey guys, welcome back to more HOA stories. In this video, a homeowner association illegally destroyed my brick wall that surrounded my property, claiming that I'm encroaching on HOA property. Here is what happened. Let's dive right into the video. So I live in the same house that has been in my family for a few generations, and I know at first glance that my property looks a little bit different than what people are used to. Instead of a fence, I have a solid brick wall around my property. The brick wall is also connected to parts of my house, and I know that people just want to know why, because it's always the first question I get. The truth is kind of boring in the fact that I'm not really sure what the reasoning was for it. The closest answer I really have is that I heard my grandfather was kind of a crazy guy that was a little bit too paranoid about people coming onto his land. The wall gets plenty of attention from new people in the neighborhood, and it has just kind of become a signature thing that makes my house unique from others. Of course, when something is different or strange, there's always gonna be one person or group that thinks it means bad. In this case, it was the local HOA who only formed about 5 years or so before the events of this story. The HOA hated the wall and demanded multiple times for me to get rid of it. But I was not a member of this HOA and did not need to conform into doing what they wanted. I did not know about how crazy they could get until after the fact when I found this site and started reading all the stories. It's comforting to know that mine was not the only crazy one. I was out of state for business and the trip was taking forever because meetings kept getting pushed and dates kept getting changed. I usually am only gone 2 or 3 days, but it was over a week at this point. I had my neighbor getting my mail for me, so when he called I assumed it had something to do with that. Instead, I answered the phone to him frantically telling me that there was a construction crew on my property that had knocked down a section of my wall. I was packing up my stuff and going home as fast as I could to deal with the problem. I also called the non-emergency police line to tell them the situation so they could maybe try and make the crew stop before destroying more of my property. They were able to get things to pause until I could get home and sort things out. I confronted the HOA president, and between anger and the long trip, I had zero time for manners. I was simply blunt and flat out asked him if he was crazy or just stupid to think that he could go on my property and knock down my wall for no reason. He started BSing that the wall was on HOA property, so that meant that they were in their right to remove it. Then he made the biggest mistake by threatening me to take the rest of the wall down and make sure that I would be the one getting the bill for it. I am not the kind of person to sit back and allow myself to be spoken to like that. I said they had zero right to my property, and if they tried to destroy anything else, I would be making sure that he ended up behind bars for it. I don't like to mess around, so I got a lawyer and hired a surveyor to check the land. The last thing I wanted was for the HOA to be actually right and the wall not being on my land or something. However, they found zero issues and that the wall in fact is 100% on my property within the lines, including the section that is now missing from the HOA being idiots. I have my lawyer send them the letter along with a notice to pay to rebuild what they destroyed. Or I will pursue legal action against them. They actually said that I must have gotten a bad surveyor and they knew they were in the right. They were stubborn and refused to back down and claiming they needed to come back on a finish taking down the wall. I then filed a lawsuit against them because I just did not want to play around with their dumb games. Let a judge tell them that they are wrong, so if they try again I can make sure they go to jail or something. The civil case was to get the money to repair the wall they damaged plus legal fees, but they decided instead of agreeing to pay that taking it to court was the smarter choice. The HOA president stood right in front of a judge and claimed that the HOA had control of the land within their jurisdiction, regardless of if the property owners are members or not, trying to say that they wanted the wall gone because it did not comply with their HOA standards. Which is the first time I was hearing that version of their story, as their old one of my wall being over the property line did not get brought up at all. The judge shut that thinking down and told them that they could not control what people did on their personal properties if they were not members of the HOA, and that land did not belong to them, they were just allowed to manage the public spaces, shrinking their ego significantly, and then the topic was brought up about the value of my home. I don't keep track of that kind of thing since I never had intentions to sell the home. It turns out that my unique brick wall caused the value of my house to go up actually, and without it the home would be significantly cheaper. It also turned out that the HOA president's sister, who for some reason joined him in court, admitted to wanting to buy my house. So the entire thing had nothing to do with HOA bylaws or property lines, it just had to do with tanking my property value because she wanted to buy my house but make it cheaper first. Which honestly did not make sense to me, because even if the wall was gone, I never gave indication that I was gonna sell my house. The judge did not give the HOA his time of day, with all the evidence clearly being against them and their side having nothing. I was granted money for my legal fees and repairment of my wall, plus I even managed to get some money from punitive damages since the HOA acted with so much misconduct as an organization. The HOA president had to publicly give an apology at an HOA meeting in front of most of the neighborhood before announcing that he was gonna be stepping down from the position. Not only him, but a few others also stepped down from just pure embarrassment. It was the only HOA meeting I will ever go to in my life, and it felt sweet to watch him squirm. I used the money to rebuild my wall and also make sure it was more secure all around the perimeter. I just know that he would want to sit on another HOA board, and now he is a young guy who is just totally barred from doing so because he abused his power. With my property fixed, I finally felt like I could relax and things would get back to normal. I found a new kind of appreciation for my wall and having such a different thing than everybody else. I never thought much about it before, since it was just always there to me. A beautiful reminder of my family history in the town and what I hope is more generations to come. And the next one is another HOA story which you don't want to miss. So please don't turn off the video. This one is titled "Dealing with HOA board members acting unethically or illegally." Part number 1, posted by user smoothsecurity4607. So I recently bought a house in a small subdivision. One family used to own all the land in this area and sold off chunks of it to be developed. In the case of my subdivision, they still owned land on both sides of it and wanted a way to get back and forth easily. So they retained an easement granting rights to their family only along one side of the subdivision. Basically, a gravel road that runs next to the property line in the backyards of several houses. Some time ago, the family sold off the other property on the far side and told the homeowners in the subdivision that they did not need to use the easement anymore and the neighbors could do what they wanted with that land. The neighbors at that time had a handshake agreement to keep the gravel road accessible, so the neighbors could use it a couple times a year for backyard maintenance. My house is the first one along the street, so it controls the access for the rest of the neighbors. But by the time I bought the house, 3 branches had grown over the gravel road and nobody had used it for several years. The seller told me that I would have the right to fence in the area if I wanted to. Fast forward to buying the house and having my small kids chase one too many balls into the street, I decided I needed to build a fence not only for privacy, but to keep them safe. The VP of the HOA board has a house further down the gravel road, and it turns out he wants access to it again, and he is also the only one on the architectural committee and would have to approve any fences. Instead of approving my fence, he sent me a certified letter with all the legal reasons that he had rights to use the gravel road. First, he says he has been using that gravel road since before there was even a house built on my lot, and he did not need anyone's permission to use it. Which does not seem to make sense, because the other lots besides his are private property, so he would legally need someone's permission even without a house on them. Second of all, he claims that the easement was established for the subdivision, meaning he thinks just because the easement is there, everyone has rights to use it. But in reality, nobody in the subdivision has rights in the actual recorded easement, only the original family. Third, he claims that his use of the gravel road for more than 10 years gives him something called a prescriptive easement. But in my state, it takes a lot more than that to prove a prescriptive easement. In particular, since the homeowners allowed their neighbors to use that area, their use was not considered adverse and therefore cannot be used to claim a prescriptive easement. The way the courts look at it, if you are being nice to one of your neighbors by giving them permission to use part of your property, they cannot come back later and try to use this against you to take away your rights. The certified letter was also signed by our HOA president. So I wrote to him and asked, what is all this stuff then? And isn't it a conflict of interest for the VP to be involved in any board decisions around this since it affects him personally? Comment number 1. If the property is not legally yours, I don't know how you would have the right to fence it. Is that part of your parcel on your warranty deed? Comment number 2. This basically comes down to a legal question with differing opinions. It sounds like you did some research and you're probably right, but you should both get an opinion from an attorney. I don't think there's necessarily a conflict of interest with the VP, since other owners would also benefit from the decision, although if he's the only one who uses it, it might be perceived as a conflict. Part 2 to the story. So I wrote to the HOA president stating that I would like to work something out with the neighbors to give them permission to continue using the gravel road as they had done in the past, but I questioned why the HOA is trying to get involved with my private property, not common HOA property, when they have no legal authority here. I also pointed out that all the legal reasons the VP sent me in his letter were not valid legal arguments and basically made no sense. The president responded that since none of us are lawyers and, ignoring the clear conflict of interest, that the VP had hired a lawyer to get a legal opinion on the matter so that we can all move forward and be in compliance with actual state law. Soon, I received a letter from his lawyer. It contained the exact same incorrect legal arguments as the VP's original letter, sometimes using the exact same words. That the VP had used the gravel road since before my house was built and therefore did not require permission. This was false because the lots that the easement ran through were all private property, also irrelevant for any modern day take on the situation. Also that the recorded easement was established for the subdivision and therefore it gave the VP some rights. Also false because the recorded easement only gives rights to the previous landowner and nobody else. The easement is shown on the subdivision's plat map, however, it has a number that references the recorded one. That the VP has used the gravel road for more than 10 years and therefore has established a prescriptive easement which I cannot legally take away. That is also false. The other conditions to establish a prescriptive easement were not met, and mainly that there was a handshake agreement among all the homeowners and the previous owner of this house gave permission for everyone to use it. No competent lawyer who actually reviewed the recorded easement could have come to these conclusions. So I did some research into what kind of idiot lawyer the VP had hired, and for one thing, the lawyer's office is over 100 miles away, so I got curious about the whole thing. I looked up the law firm's website and they proudly announced that they service customers for something called Legal Shield, which is an MLM operation where you pay $30 a month for affordable legal help when you need it, including writing one free letter a year, but not doing one free easement analysis a year, so it's pretty clear what happened, at least to me. The VP promised to hire a lawyer to review the easement even though he has a conflict of interest, but didn't. He merely told his $30 a month lawyer exactly what he wanted him to write in the letter, ignoring any actual facts or laws. And now update to the story, which is part 3. And a small summary. First of all, I want to build a fence around my backyard and the HOA VP is worried it will restrict his access to an easement going through the area, which he has been using but without any legal rights. So the other neighbors along the easement have fenced in yards and their fences not reaching the back of their properties but allowing room for the easement owner to use a gravel road. This easement owner has told everyone years ago that he no longer needs access, so any fence on my property would just have to consider the use by the other neighbors even though they have no legal rights. Because of large trees on my property, it's impossible to build a fence in line with the rest of the neighbors. I asked the HOA, what if I build a fence just past the trees, still allowing an access road 12 feet wide? This would basically cut my backyard in half. They said no, that was too narrow, even though the road on the rest of their properties averages 12 feet in width due to fencing or landscaping. So I submitted plans for a fence that goes all the way around the property with gates on each end of the gravel road to mitigate the fact that there is still a legal easement through the property just in case. And that I planned on giving the neighbors permission to go through there a couple times a year as they've been accustomed to. The HOA wrote back and said they consulted with a lawyer who said my property is subservient to the easement which they all have rights to. So giving the neighbors permission was not good enough. I would have to sign something agreeing to give the neighbors permanent use of my property. The gates would need to be equipped with keypads and they would be given codes. They would have the rights to use it 24/7. I told them obviously I was not gonna agree to this. A few weeks later they sent another email rescinding their permission to build a fence, demanding that I trim the trees along the easement area to allow the VP to get through, or according to the CC&Rs, they would hire a landscaper to come on my property, trim my trees and bill me for it. Just to be clear, there's nothing in the CC&Rs about trimming trees for this reason, or anything about governing the easement at all. The HOA and properties within the HOA are not granted any rights. The HOA should not even be involved with this at all, except for the VP ignoring this conflict of interest, ignoring his fiduciary duties, and abusing his position within the HOA to try and get what he wants. I told them to stay the hell off my property and that they would be hearing from my lawyer, and put up chains with no trespassing signs on each end of the gravel road. Any ideas of giving neighbors permission to use that area are now history. I saw some advice in a different Reddit sub that said, never argue with stupid people because they don't know that they are stupid. Which really sums up the situation, except I have no choice. The stupid people in question run the HOA and are in a position to abuse their power. And yeah, Ripestars, it seems like this actually fixed the situation because there are no further updates to the story, so I suppose the no trespassing signs and chains actually worked. Props to OP. And now let's move on to the next story. It starts like this. I was visiting my girlfriend at her townhouse. The townhouse is at the entrance of the neighborhood and not far from it is a sign warning of cars being towed. On the sign was the name and number of the towing service. In the section of this subdivision with the townhomes there are a few clearly designated no parking zones, but no such designation out in front of her townhome where I was parked. About 8:30 that evening, while we were upstairs kicked back watching TV in her bed, I suddenly saw some lights flashing through the upstairs window and then a knock on the front door. When I looked out, I saw my car hooked up to a tow truck with the driver just standing there waiting for me to come down. He had pulled up, hooked up my car and then turned on his lights rather than pulling into the neighborhood with his lights on. I went downstairs to protest him hooking up my car and pointed out that it was not in a no parking zone. He then informed me that according to HOA rules, the spaces in front of all the townhomes were no parking zones, even if they were not marked as such. I found out later that this was true, although my girlfriend was never aware of such a rule. He then offered to drop my car if I paid a $90 drop fee. This was his shtick, collect drop fees without actually having to tow a car. In the short 3 weeks that he had the contract for this subdivision, he already hit numerous homes in the neighborhood with this scam. And then this guy made a mistake. In his attempt to be seen as the good guy just doing his job harassing people late in the evening for quick scores, he offers to write on the ticket that he towed the car to the townhouse from a nearby interstate instead of writing it up as a drop fee for illegal parking. In this way, according to him, I could turn it into my auto insurance to get them to cover it. That way, I could get my money back from the scam he was running, collecting drop fees from unsuspecting homeowners. I accepted the offer, which at the time seemed like I was catching a bit of a break. Being thrown out of bed and having an angry confrontation with a tow truck driver seemed just a bit more tolerable, knowing that I would be able to get my money back. Still, the situation just eats at you and it's hard to let it go in the moment, even if eventually you are getting your money back. The next part of the story involves a wealthy landowner who developed his family's 300-acre farm to create this subdivision, and who continued to live in a more affluent elite section of the subdivision and maintained a position as the head of the HOA that created this rule of no parking zones that existed only on paper and that had been added years after the townhomes had been built with their clearly marked no parking zones. Sorry for that run-on sentence, but I won't go any further into that part of the story for the sake of brevity, which may seem a bit ironic at this point. Let it suffice to say that this HOA and the jackass running it are not much loved, and what took place between me and this towing company was a small victory over them as well. Anyhow, the next morning I began thinking more clearly about the night before, even if I was still a bit pissed. I wanted revenge for the intrusion and the injustice of others wielding power over me, and then it dawned on me that what this driver was doing might be illegal. I called my sister-in-law, who owns an auto insurance company, and I wanted to confirm my suspicion that the way this tow truck driver wrote out his towing tickets constituted insurance fraud. She confirmed that I was correct, that what this driver was doing was indeed insurance fraud, and I then called up the towing company and told them that if they did not give me a full refund, that I would be turning them in for insurance fraud. 15 minutes after I made that phone call, the tow truck driver that so kindly offered to drop my car for $90 showed up at the townhouse with cash to give me a full refund. He then went to several other homes on that street and gave refunds to other people he had extorted in the 3 weeks that he had the contract for that subdivision. I then watched as he drove down to the end of the street, the entrance of the subdivision, got out and removed the sign with the tow company's name and number. He cancelled his contract with the HOA. After word got around about what had happened and why, it took the HOA 6 months to find another tow company to take the contract. The reason the HOA under that guy's rule had changed regulations to not allow parking in front of townhomes was simply that the townhomes were at the front of the subdivision, so he and a few other wealthy homeowners thought it was unsightly to have cars parked at the curb when they drove by. That's it, they simply did not like the aesthetics and their sensibilities took precedence over the rights of the lesser inhabitants of this fiefdom. Had I actually lived in that neighborhood, I think I would have taken more drastic measures up to and including getting this tow company's license revoked and maybe even jail time for the truck driver, not to mention creating a bigger legal headache for the HOA. My girlfriend, however, is an immigrant and fearful of American power structure, so she insisted I be satisfied with a refund, which is a win against corruption she would have never dreamt of in her home country. I abided by her wishes. Finally, she found a new home, an actual house in a different neighborhood with an HOA that operates with an actual bare minimum of interferences with residents and is very pleased with the way it is run. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I guess you can also find good HOAs. However, I feel for that poor woman that came to America and probably wanted to escape corruption, only then to be faced with a homeowner association. I guess it would not be too easy for her to find a new neighborhood without an HOA, since HOAs are just getting more and more common. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripestories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you again tomorrow.